Shalom and welcome back to Che Languages. Now I know it's been a little while since I made my last video, but I'm finally getting around to making part 3 to 3 Forgotten Germanic Languages. Now, let's not stick around for too long and just get on with the video. Yalla! The first language I'd like to talk about today isn't so niche on the scale that it's a minority language or anything. It is the official language of the country, but it's a country that's often forgotten. The language in question is Luxembourgish. Here is their flag, and believe it or not, I recently found out that it has no relation to the flag of the Netherlands whatsoever. It comes from this, which was an old flag of the Duchy, or rather the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. By the way, it's the only Grand Duchy that still exists. And there is an actual debate in Luxembourg whether they should actually change to this flag, which is currently the civil flag and civil ensign, which is kind of like an alternative flag but not the official one, due to the similarity with the Netherlands flag. Alas, this is about language, not flags. So the language itself is called Luxembourgish. The G is silent. It has around 430,000 speakers. I did find another source, that being Omniglot, that said it had 600,000, but they didn't have any reference for that. It's part of the Moselle-Franconian branch, or sub-branch rather, which is a High German dialect group. Here it is on the map. As you can see, the very small country of Luxembourg is in the west, but it actually spreads into northern Germany as well, and a little bit into France and Belgium, where other dialects exist. And there is a surprising amount of dialect variation of Luxembourgish itself. It's part of its neighbouring Arion, or I think it's Arlon, sorry, and Thionville, which are in France and Belgium respectively. But actually within the country itself there's some dialect variation. Despite being very small, a native Luxembourger can tell which village somebody is from based on the way they speak. Talking of the ways that you speak, here is the phonology of the language. Now, it's not too unusual for a Germanic language, but I do find it interesting that they have a difference between r and r. They actually make a distinction with two different r's there. And here are the vowels, again, typical of a Germanic language. In fact, it's a lot more similar to the Scandinavian Germanic languages in terms of its vowel qualities, at least at first glance. Here's the official alphabet of Luxembourgish, and what's interesting is they have an umlaut E, where German does not, although it represents a schwa, as you can see here as well, which gives you an insight to their orthography. The letter G scares me a bit, I have to admit. The fact that it can represent 9 different phonemes, or sorry, that's 10. I'm not Che maths at the end of the day. The fact that it can represent 10 different phonemes is a bit scary, although I imagine there's a pattern to this and you get used to it very quickly. So let's look at an example of Luxembourgish to finish this. Here we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it looks like German to me, but then you see things like the umlaut U, and then I see other things like the doubled up letters remind me more of Dutch. It's right next door to Limburgish, if you remember that from my last video. That being said, it's actually more closely related to Standard German than it is to Limburgish, despite being right next door. Still not mutually intelligible with modern German, however, and very distinct. It wasn't classed until its own language until after World War II. Before then it was just seen as a German dialect, but now it has got its own standard orthography and is spoken by almost everybody in Luxembourg. They have to learn it at school, even the immigrant population, which is quite large. But for now, let's move on to our next language of the day. So the next language is actually debated whether it's a language or just a dialect, that being Scots, which is, quite predictably, spoken in Scotland. And it's spoken mainly in the southern and eastern parts of Scotland, whereas the north and western parts of Scotland are Gaelic speaking. However, before we start this section, I'd like to mention this video's sponsor, which is me. So not really a sponsor, but I made a video on Scottish independence on my second channel, which is about politics. The name will probably change because it's not great for search results right now. It comes up with Yair Lapid, politics, and Yair shouldn't be too much of a surprise. But if you want to learn about Scottish independence, I made a 15-minute video on it. I talked about the pros and cons of it. I did briefly mention about the languages. I said that I would go into more detail in my language channel, so that's what this section is right now. So let's begin. Scots is called Scots in Scots, but there are some other names for it. In Gaelic it's called Albais, or it might be Albé, I don't know. And then it's called Lowlands, which is a Scots appropriation of lowlands, and this is one of the names for the literary dialect of Scots, although sometimes it can refer to all of Scots. But there's also this term bread, which means broad, and that refers to sort of the spoken variety of Scots. Doric is another name that's used, though it specifically refers to one dialect which is seen as older than the others, a more conservative old dialect, which is why it's called Self-Doric. It's a reference to Doric Greek. It's historically been seen as an English dialect. However, this is a debatable subject itself and has been for a few centuries now. There are between 100,000 and 1.6 million speakers, and this is because it depends where you classify. It's really difficult to say who is a true Scots speaker and who's just speaking English with a Scottish accent and using some Scots words in it, which is where the dialects whole thing, it gets a bit confusing. At the end of the day, it is, for the most part, largely intelligible with English, although confusion can arise at times. The person who popularised it, however, and made the literary language of Scots was Robert Burns, the famous poet. There are other writers, poets, authors, filmmakers even, that have popularised Scots, but the famous national poet of Scotland is Robert Burns. However, since Robert Burns' time, the Scots language actually declined in favour of English. But since 2010 and the rise of Scottish nationalism, which I talk about in my video on Scottish independence, the language is really starting to pick up again. Here's the phonology of Scots. One interesting feature is it preserves some of the older sounds of Old English, like ch. And also, here's the natural description of the orthography. So you can see, for example, GH represents ch. Finally, we have their actual alphabet itself. What I like is it also preserves the Old English letter yoch, which fell out of use with the invention of the printing press in England, but it's been preserved in Scots. And you can find signs like this all across Scotland now because they have a bilingual policy, and you can easily find signs in Scots, even in the Gaelic speaking areas. Also, here's a map of the dialects of Scots. I must mention that there's also Ulster Scots, which is the dialect spoken in Northern Ireland, although that's dying itself. But as you can see, like I said, it's mainly restricted to the south and east, but that's where most of the main cities are, such as Glasgow, Aberdeen, and of course Edinburgh. Finally, let's take a look at an example of Scots. It's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and as you can see, it shares similarities with English, but is different. All body souls are born free and slef in mens en recht. They are doted with wit and stickles and sweet act theta and anita in a spirit or breathe head. I'm not a Scots speaker, but I thought I could have a go at that given how similar it is to English. And if you hear it spoken, it does sound just very similar to Scottish English, which is why there is a bit of a debate on how much of it is English versus how much of it is its own language. But that's enough for Scots, so let's move on to our final language of the day. Now, the final language of the day is a language which many people were asking for. However, they were asking for the more well-known version of the language. It's actually a small language family, and there's a West, North, and even an East variety. The West variety of this language is very well known. It's a co-official language in the country it lies within and gets lots of attention. However, the Northern variety, North Frisian, which is spoken in Schleswig and I believe southern parts of Denmark and northern Germany, does not get anywhere near as much the same attention. They also have one of the coolest tricolour flags in all of Europe. So here's a map of the Frisian languages. Again, the one in the Netherlands, West Frisian, is very well known. However, just here we have North Frisian, and it doesn't get anywhere near the same amount of attention. There is also an East Frisian language, which we will talk about another time because that's even more endangered, but we'll save that for another time. And also here's a map of Noord-Friesland. So North Frisian has many different names. The most popular one, or the most standard one at least, is Noord-Friesk, but there's all sorts of other varieties of that, and we'll get onto why in a second. There are around 10,000 speakers as of 1976. It's really difficult to get any modern figures on it. There's an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 speakers now. Nobody really knows, which is quite odd given that that is an old statistic now. And there are around 10 dialects, which is why there's different names for it, and we have a map of all the dialects here. Despite being spoken in a very small area, there is quite a lot of dialects difference, similar to Luxembourgish earlier. So the phonology, we have the vowels, is also known for its interesting diphthongs, and then we also have the consonants. The diphthongs are quite unique. For example, the one that looks like an O, an E and an I, I've never seen in any language before. And it has a very large range of vowels as well to go along with it. This of course makes it quite difficult to write, and there's no standard orthography. This section is going to be quite short, however, because again there's not a lot on the language. I can find the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but I've got it in several different dialects. This isn't even all of them, there are more dialects, these are all the ones I could find it in. So you can compare them to one another. It would be great if we had a West Frisian speaker from the Netherlands actually here to compare with their Frisian and tell me what they think about it, if they can understand it, how similar it is, or whether it's completely unintelligible, just like Frisian and English are today, despite them being quite closely related, theoretically. So that's it for this section, and I'm going to wrap this video up now. So that's all for today's video. We have beautiful Luxembourg City behind us. I'd love to go there someday soon. And I hope that you have enjoyed the languages and found them interesting within this video. Tell me which one is your favourite. I think my favourite is Luxembourgish. Just something beautiful about it, I guess. And I apologise that this video came a little bit late. People have been asking for it for quite a while, but it's here now, and we're back to a weekly schedule once again. So once again, I thank you for watching. Please do consider subscribing, it really does help me out. And tell me what you think in the comments, and I will see you next week. Yalla.